The galaxy had never feared humans. To the great empires that ruled the stars, Earth was nothing more than a forgotten speck, a primitive, war-torn world incapable of posing any real threat. Humanity's wars, its conflicts, its endless struggles for dominance were seen as signs of weakness, not strength, a species too divided, too unpredictable. When the Xelari Dominion, one of the largest and most ruthless militaristic civilizations in the known galaxy, expanded its reach, Earth was marked as a simple conquest, no different from the countless worlds they had absorbed before. The invasion began without warning. Massive dreadnoughts slid into orbit, jamming all planetary communications. Cities plunged into darkness, satellites lost connection, and in the skies above, Xelari warships began deploying their ground forces. Towering dropships, sleek and mechanical, descended toward major population centers like arrows fired from the heavens. Humanity barely had time to react. Military leaders scrambled to understand the scale of the invasion. Governments fell into chaos and news networks flooded the airwaves with panic. Earth had never faced an external threat like this before. Then the first strike came. Xelari assault. Troops deployed in coordinated waves, their advanced weaponry designed to neutralize resistance before it could form. Their fleets targeted military bases first, vaporizing entire facilities in seconds. They had done this before, crushed civilizations far stronger than Earth in mere days. But something unexpected happened. Despite their overwhelming technological advantage, the Xelari began encountering resistance, chaotic, disorganized, but relentless. Humans did not flee in terror as expected. They fought back. Civilians armed themselves with whatever they could find, forming guerrilla resistance in the streets. Isolated military bases, cut off from command, began launching counteroffensives. The enemy had underestimated just how fast humans could adapt. As the Xelari forces pushed deeper into human territory, their battle algorithms began to fail. The chaotic nature of human warfare was not something they had accounted for. Unlike other conquered species, humans refused to fight by the book. They didn't surrender. They didn't break. The Dominion had assumed this war would be over in days, but Earth was not falling as easily as they had predicted, and they were starting to realize their mistake. The Xelari had expected compliance. What they found instead was chaos. Their fleet's tactical AI had mapped Earth's infrastructure, predicting the most efficient routes to cripple resistance. Within hours, the global defense grid was compromised, major communication hubs silenced, and strategic cities occupied. By all logic, the war should have been over, but humans had never followed logic. The first true battle erupted in what was once the North American sector, a region the Xelari believed to be strategically vital. Their forces had landed in multiple locations, focusing on eliminating military remnants and securing logistical points. But something was wrong. The humans were still fighting, not as soldiers following a structured command, but as individuals, disconnected yet synchronized in a way no war doctrine could predict. Entire cities had gone underground, using the ruins as cover, striking with precision at Xelari supply chains. Power grids were deliberately sabotaged by civilians, causing widespread confusion in the enemy ranks. The moment the Xelari established a foothold, it would be torn apart from within. It was warfare unlike anything the Dominion had seen before. Taki. Xelari had conquered hundreds of worlds, but none like Earth. Other species had surrendered the moment their leaders fell, but humans? They had no singular ruler. Nations had collapsed, yet the war continued. They fought in the shadows, striking and vanishing, and then the first major victory came. Near what was once Washington, D.C., a Xelari command station was destroyed in a coordinated strike, not by trained military forces, not by an organized resistance, by civilians, using stolen Xelari weapons, improvised explosives, and sheer reckless ingenuity. They brought down an enemy outpost, not a major one, but enough to send a message. Aboard the Xelari command ship, Supreme Strategist, Tavan watched the battle reports with growing disbelief. The invasion was not progressing as planned. These figures, they're impossible, one of his advisors muttered. Tavan's eyes narrowed. No, they are human. He had read their history. He knew their wars. And now, For the first time in this campaign, he felt something unfamiliar. Doubt. The Xelari had underestimated the sheer adaptability of the human species. For every strategy they devised, humans countered with something unpredictable. Their war doctrine relied on superiority in numbers, coordination, and overwhelming firepower. It had worked flawlessly across countless conquered worlds. But Earth was different. No central government meant no single point of failure. No planetary defense grid meant no singular weakness to exploit. Humans fought on their own terms, and the Xelari were losing control. The Battle of Paris was their first real defeat. The city had fallen within hours of the initial invasion. The Xelari controlled its streets, its airspace, its underground tunnels. But the humans hadn't left. They had simply disappeared. Days passed. Patrols were ambushed. Supplies began to vanish. Weapons caches exploded without warning. The Xelari couldn't see their enemy, but they felt them everywhere. Then, one night, the city burned. Explosions ripped through occupation strongholds. Xelari command centers were bombed from below, as if the very ground had turned against them. Hundreds of elite soldiers were lost in a single night. The few survivors spoke of humans wearing their armor, wielding their weapons, blending into the darkness. By dawn, Paris was no longer under Xelari control. The Dominion did not tolerate failure. On board the Xelari command ship, Supreme Strategist Tavan stood before the holodisplay, watching the chaos unfold across Earth. This is beyond unacceptable. His voice was sharp, controlled, but beneath it, there was something else, something his subordinates had never heard from him before. Frustration. This species should not be able to resist us. An intelligence officer hesitated before responding. Sir, they are not resisting. Tavan's gaze snapped to the officer. Explain. They are not defending a position, nor are they attempting to hold territory. The officer swallowed. They are hunting us. For a moment there was silence. Then, for the first time in Dominion history, a Xelari strategist requested reinforcements against an inferior species. The war was changing. The Xelari had come to Earth as conquerors. Now they were prey. Across every occupied city, the same pattern emerged. Their supply lines were severed, their patrols vanished. Their reinforcements arrived only to find ghost towns where human forces should have been. This was not war. This was a massacre. The Xelari's greatest weakness was their reliance on efficiency. Their empire functioned like a machine. Every campaign, every battle, every occupation followed a rigid doctrine of control and overwhelming force. But humans did not fight like a machine. They fought like nature itself. They adapted. They learned. They became something else. The turning point came in São Paulo. The Xelari had fortified the city into an impenetrable stronghold, believing it to be their greatest strategic hold in South America. Thousands of Xelari troops, heavily armed and supported by air patrols, stood watch over the region. But then, their ships began to explode. One by one, key landing zones and supply depots vanished in flames. Explosives were placed in air vents under bridges, inside the very foundations of their fortifications. They weren't fighting an army anymore. They were fighting ghosts. And then, the broadcasts began. The Xelari command screens flickered, hijacked by human signals. The first images were not of military leaders, not of politicians, but of ordinary people. Civilians, factory workers, students, all arming themselves, preparing for war. A simple message followed. You came here thinking we were weak. That was your first mistake. Within 2 days, São Paulo fell, not to a military force, to the people. Tavan felt something he had never experienced before. Not just frustration, not just disbelief, fear. This wasn't just a failed campaign anymore. This was the beginning of something else. Something the Dominion had never faced before. Something they had no idea how to stop. An enemy that refused to be conquered. The Xelari invasion fleet had arrived expecting submission, compliance, and a swift conquest. Instead, They had woken a storm. Entire Xelari battalions had vanished without a trace. Their fortresses turned into traps, their supply chains shattered, their strategies useless. The humans weren't just resisting anymore. They were chasing them down. The fall of Berlin was the breaking point. The Xelari had fortified the city as their central command on Earth, believing it to be unassailable. With defensive shields, plasma artillery, and the most advanced Dominion technology, they were confident in their control. And yet, the city fell in a single night. Not to an army, not to superior firepower, but to silence. One by one, command centers lost communication. Patrols failed to report in. By dawn, when the Xelari attempted to regroup, they found only ruins, their generals, officers, and strategists gone. The few survivors were found wandering in the streets, weapons abandoned, eyes wide with terror. When questioned, they spoke of shadows that moved, of an enemy they never saw coming. The Dominion had never faced this before, a war that could not be mapped, an enemy that refused to follow logic, a species that did not break. The retreat begins. For the first time in Xelari history, an invasion force was recalled. Taven, once the supreme architect of planetary conquests, stood in the hollow silence of his command ship, watching the last of his warships leave Earth's orbit. He had conquered worlds, civilizations, empires. He had studied the histories of species long before they knew of spaceflight. But he had never encountered anything like this. The humans did not fight for victory. They fought to survive. And nothing in the galaxy was more dangerous than a species that refused to die.